Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Shannon Dereho from Creamer Media Webinars. It's great to have you with us for part 2 of our Energy Outlook webinar series, where our expert panel will discuss investment in South Africa's electricity transmission grid. Grid constraints continue to hinder new generation investments and limit the pace of energy reform. This webinar brings together a panel of experts to unpack the progress being made to expand grid capacity, the readiness of the National Transmission Company South Africa to accelerate investment, and the steps needed to mobilize greater private sector participation. But before we dive into today's conversation, we'd like to say a big thank you to our sponsors, ACTOM, the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa, Engie South Africa, Pele Green Energy, and Discovery Green for their generous support in making this important conversation possible. Also, just a few quick housekeeping notes. You'll find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please post your questions there at any time. Our panelists will do their best to cover as many as possible during the discussion. The chat is also open for your comments and insights. We encourage you to share your thoughts there. Just remember, questions go in the Q&A and conversations in the chat. The session is also being recorded and we'll share the link with you afterwards. We're also streaming live on YouTube, and that link will be posted in the chat once it's available. So with that, let me introduce today's facilitator, Brian Day. He's the immediate past chairperson of South African Independent Power Producers Association. Brian is an experienced electricity sector consultant with a passion for people and the environment. He has extensive experience in strategic policy, as well as resource development, feasibility, and financial modeling. Brian will be guiding the conversation with our distinguished panel, which includes Andrew Etzinger, the General Manager for Energy Market Services and International Trader at National Transmission Company South Africa. He's standing in for NTCSA CEO Mondebala, who has been called away at short notice. Mervyn Naidoo, the Group CEO of ACTOM. Tafadzwa Chibanguza, the CEO of the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa. Precious Edward, Head of the Independent Power Producers Office in the Department of Electricity and Energy. Sanjeev Mungroo, the Managing Director for Renewables and Batteries at Engie South Africa. And Andre Nepgen, the CEO of Discovery Green. It's an impressive lineup, and we're looking forward to an engaging discussion. So, Brian, over to you to lead us through today's conversation.
Thank you very much, Shannon, and a warm welcome from myself to everybody online and to our esteemed panel of guests, and dare we call them experts. Andrew, I'd like to start with you. Welcome, especially on behalf of Monde. From NTCSA's perspective, how severe are South Africa's grid constraints, and which regions or corridors is receiving the most attention and in the most demand for new generation connections?
Hi, Brian. Yeah, thanks for coming to me first. It is a situation where we certainly have over many years underdeveloped the grid, and this is largely due to the fact that the generation mix in the country is just so very different to what it was in the past. So we know that we have the coal stations in the northeastern part of the country at the moment. There's the opportunities are and where we need to develop renewables is in the southwestern part of the country where there's wind, and then of course in the Northern Cape and the other Cape regions where there is solar. So there's a substantial demand for connectivity, and we are coming off quite a low base. So if you look at 2 years ago in our annual report, you'll see that there was literally 0 megawatts added to the grid. This was before NTCSA was created, I must add. Since then, of course, we're working very hard to address that situation. We've got 2,500 megawatts of capacity, about 15,000 megawatts of transformation capacity on the go, in order to ultimately connect 34,000 megawatts of generation capacity to the grid within the next 8 years. So we're taking up the challenge. but certainly a substantial amount of work to be done. It's not only the NTCSA, of course, there are supply chains which need to be accelerated. This is to just think about the steel sector, the component sector, and I know that we've got ACTOM who can also comment on this, what it takes to accelerate, but it's a lot. There are servitudes which need to be acquired, so it is multifaceted. We are working together with the ITPs as well, the independent transmission projects, which will also help a great deal. So this is a collective effort of the whole country to get a massive program up and running, but we're up to it, and so far so good.
Andrew, thank you very much. You mentioned the ITP, and I think that's going to make a massive difference. It is, of course, a first step. It's complex in terms of the funding structure and the necessary guarantee structure which is being worked on. But it's also only a first round. And if my memory serves me correctly, the first round is going to be 1,164 kilometers of power lines, plus the associated transformation and substation capacity that goes with that. But that is literally less than 1 year's worth of the 10-year plan. So NTCSA yourselves are still having to build substantial amounts. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about the ITP that's at this stage only will reach COD around 2030. And all of the majority of the work still sits on your shoulders. What else are you unlocking in terms of EPC as a contracting strategy versus doing more of it in-house? That 34 gigawatts in 8 years, that is an enormous aspiration and obviously imperative that the necessary models are put in place to achieve it.
Yeah, firstly, I don't poo-poo the ITP. I think back to 2011 when we started the IPP program, I think there was also, bid window 1 was small and, is it going to make any difference? But that led to bid window 2, et cetera, and things really got going to the point that program, and Precious is on the call, so she can't toot her own horn. So let me say that IPP office has really done well. So you need to start somewhere. And I think that once you got your first program and your first tranche done, then, then accelerating from there, once you got your business model right, I think is something that we'll be seeing. So don't rule it out. I think there's a big expectation that we get that done. I think from our side, the big breakthrough in where we need to focus is on the servitudes, and I think that a lot has been done to get that unlocked, because without servitudes, you are really, really stuck. And secondly, in terms of the procurement phase, I think that for all the essential components on the value chain, we now have panels in place to draw on. So the procurement process will be vastly accelerated. We're open to look at different models of delivery and development, and we'll certainly do those. But I think it is ultimately, as I said, about the industry, not just NTCSA. I think we are, and you'll be aware, launching our school of transmission development. That will be launched in March. So we want, even from that point of view, to go out there. We'll have live lines to work on for the entire industry in the country to come up to speed, working with our suppliers. There are certain complexities around importing versus local, and there's the dilemma about job creation, etc. What we'd want to do is, as part of this, is not just see it as an expansion of the grid for the grid's sake, but while we're here, create jobs, create industries, create value, value chains and the like. So all of this is coming at where all of these and opportunities that we have to address unemployment, but once again to get the economy going and to get much needed capacity connected. We're up for it.
No, thank you very much, Andrew. And I think that's a great intro to Mervyn from ACTOM. What potential does South Africa's grid expansion hold for South African manufacturers and the related jobs? And do we have the capacity? And specifically, what is the capacity now versus how are we going to grow that capacity in the next 1, 2, 5, 10 years?
Good afternoon, Brian, fellow panelists, and everybody online. That's a very good point, Brian. So firstly, to look at this, my views, let's zoom out and reflect on where we are. So firstly, the bulk of infrastructure in the country from a power generation, transmission and distribution perspective was built by South African companies to a large extent, So for me, when I reflect on fixed capital formation, getting back to Andrew's earlier point, it has been relatively depressed over the past 10 years or so, with little investment into transmission and distribution. And, with that fixed capital formation 30 years ago sat at about 30%, more recently, was about 12 to 14%. So the manufacturing sector in the country has been relatively depressed. What this grid expansion gives us is demand and, more importantly, predictable demand over the next 15 to 20 years, which is actually the perfect kind of investment rationale for companies in the manufacturing sector to invest into capacity creation of that. And with that, meet the demand for infrastructure by means of building up all the various building blocks that go into this infrastructure. So for me, also touching on Andrew's point, we've got a social and economic crisis in the country, and this spend is the perfect means of triggering investment in reindustrialization, specifically in the manufacturing sector.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's move on then to Tafadzwa from the Engineering Industries Federation. How well positioned is South Africa's steel and engineering sector to support the scale of grid expansion required? And I think we've heard something around that scale, but I don't think we really understand the extent of the capacity that's going to be required.
Yeah, thanks, Brian, and afternoon to the panelists and to the participants on the call. Brian, I'll answer that in two ways. The first is that, as Mervyn, who is also our president at Seifsa, has also already mentioned, that a lot of these industries, especially the industrial backbone of South Africa, and here we're talking the steel and engineering sector, was largely built around this heavy infrastructure from mining, energy, and the rest, the rail and the like. So from a positioning, from a capability, those exist across all disciplines. Where you've had a loss in capacity is largely because of a lack of investment. Again, as Mervyn has referred to, gross fixed capital formation being pitifully low, and naturally that's had a knock-on available capacity either going to elsewhere in the world, right? So from a positioning, from a capability, that is 100%. Those disciplines exist. What we have as a major issue, Brian, is the utilization. So utilization here, and I mean, just to give you a sense, again, from a positioning point of view, we, as I've mentioned, we represent the entire metal and engineering value chain, so from steel production right down to components as well, and heavy and light engineering. On average, you're talking a sector in the order of 70% capacity utilization. But if you look at the upstream steel industry, you're there at about 50% capacity utilization, as well as, I mean, one scary one, which is one that would benefit from this transmission grid investment, is the cables, electrical cables across most of the components there are in the order of 43-50% capacity utilization as well. So again, from a positioning point of view, you could argue that these simply raising capacity for these industries could be done with them meeting additional demand before the pressures of additional investment for expansion kicks in. And in my view, then on those two levels, so capacity exists and underutilized capacity is really the issue. And it's then directing that investment to this underutilized capacity across the industry. In essence, you could turn around the picture that has been described already much quicker.
Great, thank you very much. And talking about capacity, we've had a discussion in the media as well, where I know that Seifsa and others have been involved in making representations, is around the requirement for experienced South African companies to participate in the ITP. The requirements, and correct me around the detail, the requirements are for a majority shareholder to have the experience required, which we understand. Then there's a requirement for a large shareholding of a South African entity. What is not a requirement is an experienced South African entity to bring in and to build on the existing capacity and to grow that then and use up that spare capacity. How do you foresee that rolling out in round one? And how do you see that potentially being changed and modified as Andrew was saying, we get this exponential growth from the round one of the ITP moving forward?
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, you're very right that if left in its original conception, if you like, where you have the 49% partner who comes and participates, I mean, you risk the situation of the transaction largely being a paper transaction, right? So it's a financial transaction where an entity takes a stake in a consortium, and then you don't get necessarily that deep manufacturing expertise that would come to the table for that reason at the expense of companies that would then be able to participate. And maybe I just wanted to make a broad point around the ITP in the sense that, I mean, I think like Andrew was saying, that is a necessary innovation for the fact that it brings together a constrained balance sheet and obviously private sector capability. So we applaud the direction in terms of innovation, but obviously then to bring along local industry, because the nature of private solutions is that they would come with whole solutions already packaged in the form of components as well as equipment and the rest, including the money as well. So you have a situation where local industry, in terms of the productive part of the economy, being left out for it not being a consideration. And hence, then that's why we, as you mentioned, as Seifsa, along with other industry bodies, Polasa, Manufacturing Circle, all came together and said there's a big gap here that local production capability will get excluded from, and hence then really our issue was that along with the financial capabilities that are required, also you need to make sure that you embed that into the productive capacity that exists in the sector, and that's really what we're calling for.
Great. I think it's a great exposition around a very challenging issue. If we can move then to you, Sanjeev, how does South Africa's electricity reform trajectory compare with other markets? And are the country's plans for a restructured electricity sector in line with international best practice? You're on mute, Sanjeev.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Brian. It's indeed a great pleasure to join this important conversation on the future of South Africa's transmission grid, a topic that is central to unlocking, our energy transition. Engie has entered the South African market some 2 decades ago, and we're also very proud to have pre-qualified under the first ITP program. So as Engie, we bring substantial international experience to support this effort. Globally, Engie owns and operates 5,800 kilometers of transmission lines in Brazil and Chile, with a goal of reaching 10,000 kilometers by 2030. The electricity reforms in South Africa follows trajectories of other countries when monopolies have been unbundled to allow for competition within the market. The imminent launch of the South African wholesale electricity market is a great step forward, similar to Latin America and the European Union, which should unlock investment into infrastructure and decarbonization. Our current constraints of reliance on coal and constrained transmission are opportunities, and these have been seen before. India has been heavily reliant on coal, but now are a leader in innovative and rapid renewable rollout. Chile has a unique geography, which meant major regional congestion, which catalyzed major transmission investment as well. Engie played a leading role in these countries and hope to do the same here.
Great. Thank you very much. And Precious, as head of the IPP office, also a client, if you would like, on sufficient grid infrastructure in the country. So from the IPP office's perspective, how are South Africa's grid constraints impacting on investments in new electricity generation?
Thank you, Brian, and greetings to all. The impact of grid constraint has been evident, particularly in the recent bid windows along the Cape regions. That has affected the scale and the pace of the program. And with this being recognized as a system-wide challenge, the department has been engaging constructively with various stakeholders to explore opportunities to streamline current processes and inform future approaches. These engagements are deemed essential to progressively unlock the investment envisaged in IRP 2025. And it's just to ensure that the next rounds are approached in an orderly manner, ensure bankability and build sustainable impact. So great, it is on the critical path, and it needs a concerted effort and attention. And I think we are on the right trajectory as a collective from DEE ecosystem. Thanks, Brian.
Right, thank you very much. A second question, Precious. Perhaps you can explain the role that the IPP office is playing in the ITP. A similar role as procurer, I would imagine, but if you can just elaborate on that and how it differs from the procurement of generation capacity.
It is in the same context as the procurement of the generation capacity. We are executing, the department has mandated the office to execute and implement the first phase of the procurement of the ITP.
Great. Thank you very much. Andre, as another private sector generator trader, perhaps you can talk to us about how transmission constraints impact on planning and operations of Discovery Green and the services that you provide to your clients.
Thank you, Brian. I think when you think about the challenges or the impact of this, I think it is really, there's sort of two categories to this, and we know and appreciate all the hard work that's going into to roll this out. And I know it's extremely complex on this, but if you just think about the two basic impacts, one of course is curtailment and the impact of that, and the second, of course, is the delay for new generation coming on. And I think let's maybe just let me give you a little bit of detail on this. So from a curtailment side, I don't think I need to go into too much, but we all agree that curtailment, of course, is basically a throttling, which is necessary to unlock more generation capacity, and that's a good thing. But from a large-scale economic point of view, I think we'd all agree that wasted electricity is not a good thing, and it adds to additional costs. So it's a good way to unlock more, but it is an additional cost in the short term, really, on that. And that's something that is manageable, but hopefully one day will not be a big factor really on that, and that does slow down. That does impact the attractiveness, of course, of projects as well, but understand why it's necessary. The second, which I think is probably more important, is the slowdown in new generations. I think we could all see a bit of a slowdown in the availability coming from, and it's not just in general being access to the grid, but it's very region specific access on this. So we'll agree that the Western Cape, the Northern Cape, the Eastern Cape are wonderful areas for wind assets, and we haven't seen a lot of wind coming through for quite some time on the REAP side, but on the private, but not so much on the REAP side. And we do see a bit of a generation slowdown waiting. We know the timelines being given now extend all the way up to 2030, if not longer, which is long time to wait. And unfortunately, if you think about the client side and the market side, there are very few companies, I think, with the appetite to say, listen, I will commit to something that'll only start delivering energy in 2030 onwards. So I do think we're going to see a little bit of pressure, or quite a bit of pressure on that side. And I think the one thing that South Africa largely do then is look for other opportunities. And I think it's easier to connect solar these days. And what you're going to see, in my opinion, is that the shift is going to be more towards solar, and that we also got to be aware of the unintended consequences of that. Because if they were both easy and same hurdle to build, the business case would prevail. But if one is constrained, and you can only do solar, what you're going to probably see is a bit of a worsening of the duck curve. I think everyone's quite familiar with the duck curve and the daytime prices on this. I mean, recently, if you look at California, if you look across Europe, the prices are a bit of an inverted shape. Apart from the peaks, standard is a lot cheaper, off-peak is a lot more expensive in the international markets. And I think what we're going to see if we aren't able to connect very high quality wind assets, and BESS doesn't play a bigger role, that actually plays out as well. So I think there's going to be some interesting consequences coming through. But there's a business side will definitely deal with it.
Thanks very much. Maybe you can just elaborate a little bit more on that, because I think there's a dynamic element that's coming to bear, and it's different times of production, especially with solar PV. There's a different level of predictability in PV and wind. BESS prices have radically reduced in the last 3 years. I don't think we've touched really on the demand side management, although there was not in the context of demand shifting. I think, in fact, in the energy efficiency space, Andrew himself did a lot of good work in the early days, CFLs and all of that that's just been forgotten about. But it's not so much just reducing your usage, it's shifting your usage. And perhaps you can talk about innovative offtake structures, demand aggregation, flexible consumption, and how that actually comes together in terms of optimizing the existing transmission capacity.
It's a very interesting point. I think there's a lot of work still to be done on that. I don't think we've unpacked fully all the amazing things that could be done on that. So I think maybe the first point, and I think you mentioned the role of batteries. I do think there's going to be an increasing role of batteries. The costs have come down. I don't think we're in a world yet where you can use it for a 24-hour level on that. I think economically it just doesn't make sense. But definitely in terms of load shifting and shifting peak, there is lots of potential there. So from a grid point of view and ability to manage it, I think it has value in it, definitely. And I think another alternative to worth looking at, always talk about demand side, and until the grid gets developed, the congestion is really going to be at certain nodes, and Andrew can probably speak about this a little bit more, but it's specific nodes where the congestion is, and my understanding of it is that it's not, the demand changes is not necessarily going to relieve the congestion, because it's a supply induced congestion on that. So I think there might be some innovation to be done on the congestion side of it, to actually say, listen, is there no way in which increased demand can be generated before the point or before the node actually on that? So, take the Northern Cape, for example, is there a potential means to encourage increased consumption using innovative tariff structures, incentives, other things in there to encourage demand on that side as a way to continue to develop new generation without containing it? And I think we'll keep a lookout and see what happens in that space.
Right. Yeah, decentralized economic development and the human impacts of that is an enormously positive thing. So absolutely a lot more work to be done. Before I go back to Andrew in our round two, perhaps some comments on the uncertainties that have emerged in the last few weeks around the unbundling of Eskom's grid access assets, the so-called soft unbundling, and the NTCSA remaining the owner of the assets, a subsidiary of Eskom, for longer than perhaps we'd anticipated previously, and a separate TSO, transmission system operator, for the system operator and market operator, which operates but doesn't own the assets. And do you see it? What are your concerns that you see with that in terms of the investment and actually building the necessary capacity that Andrew spoke about, that 34 gigawatts that needs to be connected in 8 years?
So Brian, I mean, it's a complex issue, just to state that up front. It's not a simple one. I think we need to separate between, what is the ideal in the end state we need to get to versus, what is the interim and practical on that. And I think currently, I don't think anyone is in disagreement. I hope not, in that, the best for competition is a completely separated one, and the assets does play an important role, I think, on that. I think the solution put forward by the minister and ESCOM, the detail is a little bit unknown around that from our point of view, and I don't think I'm experienced enough to comment on that. But generally, what we see, the reaction from the market was that they don't necessarily understand or agree with the technical reasons why. And I think there's a process now underway to try and unpack why those decisions are made, because people don't really agree on it. I think probably the most important thing from a confidence point of view, which I think is what this is really about. If you want to continue to have people getting ready to build more transmission, people to feel comfortable with the competitive market, people putting investment in it, there could be an interim solution, but we need to make sure that the end state, or whatever that plan is iterated, is stated as still being the goal and where we will get to, and we'll get to it by this date, and draw a bit of a line there. But it's complex. There's lots of issues, and hopefully over the next few weeks, we'll hope to understand a lot more of what went into that decision and unpack it.
Great. Thank you very much. So, Andrew, let's come back to you on that one. And you and I were chatting just in our prep of exactly this and the complexity of it, and the financial investability of the new grid connection capacity, and the balance sheet issues around, whether the TSO does sooner or later actually have the assets to put on their balance sheet. And what the conversations have been even this week with the lenders, because of the complexities that Andrew talks about behind the scenes, and potentially the need to change loan covenants and all of that. But perhaps give us some details, because obviously this is a hot topic, and you and Mondi and team, I'm sure, are hard at work on it. So tell us some more.
Yeah, Brian, this is squarely a policy issue, and from the government. It's not something that we, quite frankly, have time to dwell on. Whether to go left or right. I think the conclusion we came to is that either model can work. What we do know is that by law, the TSO has to be a separate company created within 5 years of the proclamation of the ERA. We are 1 year into that, so in 4 years' time, the TSO has to be created and up and running. And whether the assets remain in NTCSA or the assets, go financial point of view. And I think, as Andre was saying, I think it is a vastly complex matter. But at the end of the day, either can work. And I think we from what we see, it's not an issue. If it is to be that the assets remain in NTCSA, then those assets would still be ultimately made available, and whatever the arrangement's got to be, leased, and then the TSO would then be responsible for operating those assets. So it's not essential for the TSO to have those assets on its balance sheet in order for the TSO to be successful. And once again, if you're unwinding a company, taking out those assets, what are the lenders to the ESCOM group have to say about that? And what would they give permission? You can just imagine. It's just you go into such a lot of complexity. And as I said, 34,000 megawatts is what we have to connect. We don't have time, quite frankly, to get into the debates. Sorry, Brian, it's
Thank you.
as simple as that. I think we
Yeah.
we're working on the premise that, as the Minister explained, that we're working on the premise that the assets will stay with the NTCSA, and that, at the same time, the TSOs has to be created, and that brings with it just a substantial amount of complexity, plus the rollout, plus implementation. The policies for the Minister, not for us. We'll implement.
No, thank you very much. I hear that, and it's an important policy directive, and it does make Minister Ramokgopa's job really difficult because, of course, he is both the policy minister and the shareholder minister. There's a distinct challenge for him and his colleagues there. But thank you very much for your view that really Eskom's is getting down to do the work, and I think that's obviously really encouraging. And I don't think any of us can really understand how much that work really entails. Before I go on to a further question to Mervyn, I want to go to a question from the Q&A to you, Andrew, and thanks to Shannon for summarizing a question from Frank Spencer. With significant new distributed generation capacity coming online, how is NTCSA stroke TSO in the future ensuring transmission expansion keeps pace and is planned independently of Eskom's generation's commercial interests?
Yeah, this is a critical point. And if once a year we publish, or around once a year, we publish what's called the Transmission Development Plan. And it's vitally important that that plan be developed independently and that there not be any suspicion or, any interference by any particular party. And I would even say from the Eskom group, not that they would interfere, but that the operational independence has to be there. So there's two elements that would come into it. First, in terms of where the grid actually gets expanded, I think that is understood to be within the domain of NTCSA and later the TSO. For the time being, the balance sheet of NTCSA is still wound up with the balance sheet of the group, and I think that there is still an investment envelope which we need to comply with from the group. But the group has given us their assurance that they are not going to interfere in the prioritization of our scheduling of our projects for expansion. And so far so good. I've accompanied my colleagues to the Eskom Holdings Group, where for massive projects requiring PFMA approval, we need to go through that board, and there's been no interference. So far so good. It is certainly a matter that we need to remain vigilant to make sure that the original intention of NTCSA being operationally independent is maintained. But I think credit to the group board. I think they've respected it. The group board, together with the NTCSA board, get together once in a while just to talk about these matters, and operational independence is always first on the agenda. So I think that my principals are mindful of this particular matter, and so far I'm not aware of any issue that has arisen where the group has imposed different priorities on our expansion. So please come along to our conference once a year. It's normally at the Eskom College in Midrand, where we present the Transmission Development Plan. Very, very popular. It's on our website, the TDP. It is a regulatory approved process as well. So it's not up to us to just do it. The regulator does want oversight of it. So yeah, please, if there is any concern at any stage, please write to us, and we'll take it up. But at this stage, demand response we need, particularly in a variety of technologies to deal with the variability of solar and wind. We need flexible plant, and if there are DR options that give us that flexibility, I think coming back to what Andre said, it's worth gold. So we'd really love to connect the DR. Perhaps not so much solar. We've got more than enough solar. We spoke about the duck curve that is coming on at pace, substantial amounts of solar, but the batteries we need in great measure, and Yeah, and wind, as has been discussed, would be preferable. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And of course, the IPP survey that precedes the TDP every year is been run the last 3 or 4 years and is a profound input into that. And in that context, I think, the new Eskom Green and other new generation capacity when the Eskom group, I think, them falling in with the CELBQ process and all of the other requirements will create the sort of transparency in the process that you talk about. And I think that's perhaps you've given me an idea around, for that survey to actually include Eskom expansion, and that would create some of that transparency. So
Excellent,
thanks
yeah.
very much on some of those elements. Mervyn, let's move back to you then in terms of the practicalities of grid expansion. Perhaps you can talk more about just how South Africa can better leverage local manufacturing capacity to accelerate grid expansion while also strengthening industrialization and localization. And maybe start with the capacity that is or was there, and potentially dormant capacity, but also capacity that needs to be rebuilt that has potentially been lost or is not fully utilized at the moment.
Yeah, Brian, economics is an interesting thing. Ultimately supply matches demand. So if demand is not there, your supply will basically drop. So for me, I think one of the biggest challenges we have as the manufacturing sector is that, firstly, manufacturing the likes of transformers, switchgear, high voltage equipment, and these are capital intensive industries. So you need to invest huge amounts into factories, into specialized resources, technical resources, and that at quite a high cost. And ultimately, if demand is not there, it becomes a challenge. So fundamentally, for me, I think what we've got to do, as I said earlier, we've got demand that's predictable coming. And what we need to do is more towards strategic program procurement and that, where we move away from transactional procurement, where you have a 1 or 2 year contract, to long-term contracts of 5 to 10 years that enables investment into capacity on the one hand, where local manufacturers ramp up capacity to meet that projected demand. And getting to the next point you raised, for me, when you look at industrialization of that, we must reflect on what China did. China, over the past 30 years, what they did was quite aggressively and deliberately use their local infrastructure demand to basically leverage off that and invest into manufacturing capacity to the point where fixed capital formation was 30 to 40% of GDP. They got GDP annual growth rates up to like 10% plus per annum because of being deliberate around the industrialization of that demand in China. And over the past 30 years, the Chinese GDP per capita grew by 10 times because of that deliberate, policy that was there. And for me, I think we need to reflect on that as South Africa to say, we've got this demand, we've got the manufacturing sector, over the past 20 or 30 years that has reduced substantially, but still exists and has, skill, has the expertise in that to resuscitate, manufacturing. And but what we need to be is deliberate, and have policy that's aligned with that demand to then force localization and job creation, and ultimately will trigger and accelerate GDP growth. And for me, when I look at that, it's something, beyond just the investment into capital. We also need to look at, the life cycle costs and the life cycle support for that product. If you localize, you're then able to maintain that product across its full life cycle and maximize plant availability and reliability in that. And these are key factors beyond just, economic and social benefits.
Thanks very much, Mervyn. Staying on a similar theme, Tafadzwa, if we can come back to you. This topic of industrialization and the major industrial opportunity, really grid expansion is one of the a handful, perhaps, of the real potential big opportunities there. What policy or regulatory reforms are needed to ensure that this infrastructure investment actually translates into the sustained growth, skills development, and job growth across South Africa, across the engineering value chain?
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. You correctly identify, for example, this grid program, for example, if you look at the entire metals value chain, to touch everything from steel down through the components, right? So it's multidimensional in the places in which it touches, right? So it's a positive in that sense. Then to your question specifically around reform, around policy, what is absolutely critical is the public procurement legislation that needs to be finally bedded down. So we've got a Public Procurement Act, and largely what we are waiting on now is the regulations that underpin that act. That will then deal with issues of designation, localization, and industrialization more broadly, where industrialization plans can be crafted around different investment spend, like the transmission grid. And unfortunately, now we are in an environment, Brian, where this grid program has started in an environment where we are transitioning through public procurement legislation, through the old PFMA and the Preferential Procurement Act into what is the Public Procurement Act. And firstly, this transition has been, frankly, to call it, has been messy. We are currently operating on interim regulations that in fact gave rise to the issues that we raised. When we raised the issue around the exclusion of local in the ITP, if you look at it on the legal facts, the ITP compliant in the context of this transitioning regulations of public procurement, but obviously it's to the exclusion and to the detriment of local industry, because we don't ultimately now have the regulations that will drive public procurement and the industrialization component under public procurement. So that is the one reform that is in progress but needs to be fast-tracked, because once that's bedded down and we now have instruction notes from Treasury on things like designation, for argument's sake, we wouldn't need to have the argument that we had with NTCSA around looking at local as a participant in these programs, because it would be the law that state organs must buy from local where competitive capacity exists. A last point, Brian, and it's less about reform, but it's around policy coordination, because in many instances, we have many things moving in the right direction. So as I mentioned earlier on, we applaud the ITP as an innovation. ITP being developed, you have the credit guarantee vehicle that will ultimately underpin or underwrite the ITP. You've got Treasury going in its direction, doing that. You've got the public procurement that I've mentioned. You have issues around, for example, stage consignment and loopholes that needs to be closed there. So I'm talking on many issues that are being considered from a policy point of view, but they are not coordinated. And if that was coordinated much better, that in itself is a reform that could potentially be considered. And then you are coordinating good instruments as opposed to necessarily developing them. But on the headline would be the public procurement bill and its regulations as what we think needs to be fast-tracked.
Great, thank you very much. And on the point of public procurement, Precious, back to you again. Perhaps you can just go into some detail around what role the IPP office will play in adjudicating the ITP bids to mobilize increased investment across the country. And perhaps as an addition to that, around what can you tell us around the timing? I believe the latest that I've read is that the guarantee support mechanism should be ready for the RFP to come out in September, if I'm not mistaken. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about that as well, and how you see a potential second round playing out, notwithstanding the uncertainties around just getting the first round completed first. Thanks, Precious.
Thanks, Brian. I think, Brian, as I indicated earlier, that we implement what the department mandate us to. At this stage, I think it suffices maybe just to limit the update on the current ITP phase, and where through various engagement with the other stakeholders within the energy. You possibly recall the RFI that was issued back in December 2024, followed by the RFQ. We are currently finalizing the RFP that it is envisaged to be finalized in the third quarter of the next financial year. So that it is underway and going with the CGV development and the discussions. Those engagements are still in progress in ensuring that the first round of the ITP, it is successful. As for the second phase, we are still waiting for the mandate issuer to give an indication on the next step from that end. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Precious. Sanjeev, if we can come back to you, perhaps you can talk a little bit about the complexity around the power system and how you see specific solutions of storage, hybrid projects, and demand-side management playing in easing grid pressure, and also how the more flexibility we create, the greater the saving can be in fixed infrastructure, including aspects of curtailment, even when there is a cost to that curtailment.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So in terms of technology, I mean, we can clearly see that rolling out this transmission program, I mean, takes a long time. Also from experience, if we look at where Engie built 2,000 kilometers of line in Brazil, this took 6 years and quite difficult. So using technology and perhaps more smart solutions, so storage definitely playing part in this mix with hybrid plants and things that Andrew also mentioned about flexible dispatch offerings. I think this can definitely be seen, not just treated as add-ons, but it's a way of actually us relieving some of the transmission congestion that's there up front. So I think whilst we look at the bigger program, we certainly have to look at ways of using tech to bring some of this, to the fore. And definitely, not just Engie, but other IPPs as well. I think there's a lot to offer in this space.
Great, thank you very much. Andre, I'd like to ask you a question and then bring in Stephanie Labite's question in that as well, which I'll refer to. But in terms of looking ahead, how can private sector demand for clean power be better aligned with transmission investment decisions to ensure grid expansion keeps pace with the transition? And Stephanie asks, how might the ongoing policy and reform debate regarding the future of institutional design of NTCSA, particularly its relationship with Eskom, integrated versus fully unbundled, affect the pace and scale of the investment in terms of the electricity transmission grid expansion?
So thanks, Brian. I think maybe the second question first. I think it's to be determined really on that. I think the reaction initially was, quite concerning, and a lot of arms up in the air about that. I mean, the impact and whether or not it would change the pace of investment or the sentiment in the market is to be determined. I think we'll find out, as it goes along. Whether or not private sector is comfortable for continuing to throw in with this sort of uncertainty that comes out of it. So we'll see. And as Andrew said, if it works, then it works. But we're gonna watch and I think see what happens, and that'll determine it. On the first question, which I think is an interesting one, I think in terms of the transmission plan and what is currently being planned on that, I think there's a lot of input points really around demand that says that. I mean, the congestion is the obvious one. Where congestion is where you need more transmission, right? And where there's congestion is usually where, from an economic point of view, is where the first projects were built because the resource factors are good. So that's really a good indication of where demand is. And I think then the NTCA probably has a very good view of registrations and where project applications for CELs and budget quotes and everything else is in terms of where that should be. But to me, I think it's all really sort of, it can guide where you want to do is all really a little bit irrelevant, given that, the demand, I think, is there. The demand is absolutely there in order to stimulate economic growth. And we're seeing really green shoots of that happening. And it's very, very encouraging. Electricity and economic growth are really, really correlated on that. And you don't need one for the other, or the other one drives the, which way around it is to be determined. But I think, we all know that. And if the assumption that we make is that one is that the future is going to be renewable, or the majority of new build is going to be renewable, and two, that we assume that there's going to be a decommissioning or a slowdown in coal-based, an appropriate slowdown of that, then I think it's kind of clear you almost have to it's all about pace and getting it done quickly, because the demand, I think, is there. Just get the lines and the poles done, start building.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm going to do a final round amongst the participants, and then I have been trying to look at the Q&A in the sideline as well, and in a few minutes we will actually go to that. So Andrew, I think you really went into some detail around the last question I was going to ask you around your view on NTCSA, and I think the crucial part of that is it's primarily a policy decision. So I'm going to come back to you in the Q&A. But a question then for Mervyn around what changes in planning, contracting, or financing would give equipment manufacturers greater certainty and allow them to invest more aggressively in capacity to support the national rollout. And that links also to a question that Alex Seal has asked in the Q&A around electricity demand forecasts, but also population growth and industrial demand and the complexities on that side of it. So over to you, Mervyn.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Brian, I think it gets back to a point I just mentioned earlier around strategic procurement. As I said, at the moment, we're very much in a transactional mode, where we get short-term contracts, and that doesn't give you predictability to invest in assets that's, typically hundreds of millions, in some cases billions. So if you invest in assets, you need to have predictability in that. So I think strategic procurement, given the fact that when I look at the IPP program with the RP 2025, and when I look at the TDP and that, that quantified spend, I think is probably about 2.6 trillion rands. And at the end of the day, it's huge, over the next 15 or 20 years. And I think for me, we need to be deliberate in terms of policy on the one hand, but basically strategic procurement that then entices companies to invest. And I'll give you an example. There's been a talk about a lack of capacity in our sector. A lot of local companies have been gearing up for what's coming on the IPPs and the TDP and that. To the point of, our company, the company that I manage called ACTOM, we invested into transformer manufacturing capacity, and I'm talking about large power transformers, class 1 and above. There we've trebled our capacity, and we're sitting with basically the factory loading at the moment between our factories of approximately 1/3 of the capacity that we have. We've put in additional factory space of about 50,000 square meters. So these are huge investments. And at the end of the day, For companies to invest in this, we need predictability and bankability on these investments, to enable the return. And it only comes through policy, and it has to be deliberate. And in my view, as a country, we need to take an SA Inc. approach. Obviously, it's got to be competitive on price and lead times and that, but ultimately, it's got to be deliberate and coordinated.
Thank you very much. I'd then like to ask Tafadzwa to carry on from that thought. Is given your background in both mining and industrial economics, how can South Africa structure transmission and electricity-related investments to assist in improving the country's broader industrial competitiveness and export potential? Because and the exports is something we haven't spoken about yet, because of course there's South Africa and then there's SADC, and the potential electricity trading on the Southern African power pool. So perhaps some insight into your economics expertise there.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. It's interesting with that question, and coincidentally, just today I was looking at a graph that was put together by one of our partner associations here in the steel industry. And to give a sense, I mean, what it shows is on the steel side, but I mean, this point is valid across the entire value chain. So you have demand for steel and engineered products having declined, consumption of steel having declined. Also, that follows naturally, production would follow that as well. And then in that instance, also you have a situation where exports have also fallen while imports have doubled. But where I'm going with this point, Brian, is that the fall in exports, which between 2018 and now has fallen by about half, so 50%. The reason for that is a number of factors. Firstly, it's the punitive cost base across the many sort of inputs that are prevalent in South Africa. That's one. But also it's this economies of scale issue. So on the export market, where price is your only determinant for success or failure, you have already then companies exporting from here being penalized on the input cost base as well as the lack of capacity. So you have exports having fallen. So to your point, the SADC market would very well be a lucrative market from a proximity, from the fact that it's a developing area where a lot of these industrial products could be fed into that environment. But you have these two factors contributing to exports actually falling by about half. And I mean, that's significant in an environment where the domestic side is also falling. So maybe more structured to your question again, I'll end it on maybe just amplifying the points that were made already by Mervyn, just emphasizing the fact that to the extent that we are going to get that economies of scale going, we need policy to be deliberately directed to local. You have, he mentioned now a third of capacity, and I've mentioned the other numbers for cables and steel and the rest. Just by targeting through policy that demand to local industry, you already begin to deal with the capacity utilization and to diluting some of those fixed costs. Then the export market is much more a possibility to take on because you've dealt with that way. So that's the virtuous cycle that you then implement, that you actually initiate by doing so. So really, it's about coordination, lifting local capacity, and then that way the exports then become a natural market. Brian, let me park it there because really I'm just amplifying and I risk then repeating a lot of what Mervyn had said, but really that was how I'd amplify it.
No, thank you very much. And of course, the installed capacity of SADC is probably less than a third of the installed capacity in terms of power generation of South Africa. I don't have the exact numbers with me, but I know it's fundamentally smaller. But it's smaller, but with a high potential demand growth rate coming off a low base. So there's a massive opportunity, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Right. Again, with rising incomes, rising pressures to develop, I mean, that just follows on that you would have the need for additional electricity, additional grid capacity, generation capacity, etc. So the demand is there, but we have to be able to tackle it competitively.
Great. Thanks very much. So a question again for you, Precious. Looking ahead, how can South Africa better sequence generation procurement and transmission build-out, so that renewable energy storage and hybrid projects can be delivered faster and at a lower cost to the system. And I'd like to incorporate a question from Alex Seal in the Q&A around what supply profiles are being anticipated. So talking about renewables with their variability and batteries, around solar, wind, coal, low marginal cost, high flexibility versus high marginal cost, low flexibility, including domestic PV growth and other domestic alternative energy or demand mitigation. So quite a mouthful there for you, Precious.
Thanks, Brian. I think this goes back into the strategy of the office going forward, and in terms of what are we seeking to see different from the challenges that the recent bids has experienced. And it goes back to Mervyn's point, where he hinged on strategic procurement. And absolutely that for us to see a much more improved outcome in the next bid window, we need to sequence and align generation procurement with transmission planning. It is a critical consideration in the implementation of the IRP 2025. And I think the work it is in the advanced stages. There are engagement with key stakeholders. I mean, the likes of Andrew's on the call as well. I think from time to time we have those sessions in trying to have an outlook of what and the how we best navigate this, factoring the inputs that we had from the industry itself, the various IPPs, and to consider what affected the previous rounds. Focusing on strengthening the grid-aware procurement, improving coordination across institutions, reducing the uncertainties, responding to the predictability and the consistency of the next bid windows. We see it as a key to advance industrialization and create opportunities for the local players. And I would want to add that the likes of DTIC, they are also part of the key stakeholders that we are engaging on in seeing how best we can create or advance the opportunities for the locals. So it is in the advanced discussions in due course, and we should be able to give an indication on the next look and the shape of the next bid window, addressing the scale, addressing the predictability and the consistency thereof. I'm going to pause there, and I mean, this is on various technologies here.
Great, thank you very much. And two more contributions, and then we're going to go fully to the Q&A, although I've built in some of the questions already. But Sanjeev, a question to you around looking ahead. What policy and regulatory or market reforms would most meaningfully unlock long-term, large-scale private sector investment in South Africa's electricity system? And obviously we know about 2021 and 2022, there was Schedule 2 under the Electricity Regulation Act. 1st of January last year, the new amended act came into force. We're all waiting in bated breath for the launch of the South African wholesale energy market on the 1st of April this year. But that's also going to be a ramp-up process. But what are the key regulatory and market reforms that you see happening in the next few years that would really spur the construction and implementation that's necessary?
So if we look back and learn from at least the programs that were put in place in the past, we can see private capital came at scale, right? When certain rules were in place. and rules that are predictable, transparent, and competitive. So I think that, that would make things work a lot better. So in terms of what we want to see from policy, we want to see clear bankable transmission policy. And I think the transparent allocation of grid. And what will also help is a streamlined permitting process, because we found that also in the generation project, these cause much delays. So yeah, I'd say we need to have something published that's stable, multi-year, with access allocation with regular updates, and the market will respond, from that. So introduce more competitive open access transmission tariffs as well. And also key is to for the NTCSA to maintain an independence to avoid market distortion.
Thank you very much. And running on directly from that, Andre, looking ahead, how can private sector demand for clean power be better aligned with transmission investment to ensure grid expansion keeps pace with our South Africa's energy transition?
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for that question. I think it very much relates to the earlier one you asked, but I think it will keep pace. I think there's if you look at the amount of activity and the amount of interest in the space, I think if you look at that survey that goes out, I think it's once every year, where it looks at the increase in projects and being developed across the country. I think the jump was almost close to 80% increase in the year before. It is substantial. So I think the demand and the private sector interest in this is really there. I think there's a lot of excitement around it. So I don't think that needs to be worried. I think it is basically now just getting the infrastructure in place in order to facilitate that. And I think that's where the focus should be in it. And it sounds like it's coming.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. So we're going to have about 16 minutes of pure Q&A, and then we'll have a final 60 minutes closing comment from each of the panelists. There's a really interesting question from Neville Seal, which has been quite comprehensively stated. So I'm just going to read it, and I'm going to ask Andrew and Precious, I think, to be the key responders to this, noting that it is actually more of a policy question than an implementer question, which is the hat that both of you wear. But I think it's you will have the sort of insight on it that would be very very helpful. So the question is, there is a lot hinging for NTSA, Eskom, IPPs, industry, and the economy in the country on the successful TDP, including ITPs, as well as the many independent projects in generation. The whole RP program is fraught with risk, especially with back-end loading of the TDP program in particular, but also the nuclear and gas programs to replace the planned decommissioned coal stations. And in the first round of this webinar series, James McKay reminded us that 8 gigawatts of Eskom's coal generation is only licensed from an air emissions point of view, not a climate change issue, up to March of 2030. A lot is at stake in line with good project risk governance. What risk assessments have been done and what risk treatment mitigation plans are in place? Are there plan B and C? Andrew, if I can come to you first.
Yeah, thanks very much. And Neville, thanks for the question. It's a critical issue. Every year we publish, in addition to what's published in the IRP, the NTCSA does additional work, which is called the Medium-Term System Adequacy Outlook, and that is published on our website. And I think that I would encourage that everybody to look at that. That looks at various growth scenarios, various scenarios of generation plant performance on the Eskom fleet, and it takes into account a number of other issues, and particularly when it comes to the point about that James is making. So you've got 8 odd gigawatt hours, sorry, gigawatts of capacity scheduled to, at this stage, reach the end of its life in 2029. And then it's another 6,000, if I'm not mistaken, 1 year later. So there really are quite a lot of matters that come into this. At the same time, the Eskom generation's fleet performance is increasing steadily all the time. And I think that this is a major aspect. And if you look at the study, it basically says, if obviously they're coming off a very low base, but even a moderate performance in the performance of the Eskom fleet will cover the gap that's emerging. Bearing in mind that at the moment, and I say we on the system have got, depending on the time of day, etc., and the day of the week, etc., but probably between 5,000 and 8,000 megawatts of capacity spare. It's a fact that's not spoken about, but once again, it depends on the time of day, etc. But there are units in cold reserve. There are issues revolving around operability of the grid, which is a major risk that NTCSA is currently focused on. This comes down to a scenario where, if we talk about the duck curve, where there's so much solar being added to the grid that demand during the middle of the day is just dropping further. The net demand after that is dropping so low that the generation fleet that needs to operate in the evening and needs to come down to minimum load during the day because demand is so low. These are the types of risks which we are dealing with on a daily basis and very aware too. So our first risk, that we're dealing with is operability of the system, and it doesn't matter. We'll curtail, we'll do anything to protect the integrity of the grid. So I think that's just in our philosophy of risk management. That's where we start, and I think that during the worst of the load shedding, the fact that the grid stays stable, I think you can see where the priorities of NTCSA and the system operator in particular lie, that we will do what it takes to protect the grid. So I think and then many things flow from that. But I would say just the operability of the system. So we're speaking even about rolling out lines of capacity to connect, but what we haven't spoken about the synchronous condensers and other measures which we're putting in place, the battery systems, just to once again protect the grid and to make sure that it's operable, that we don't go the way of the Australian and European and American our counterparts who've experienced blackouts and all of that. We're simply not going to go there. So let me give you the first assurance. And secondly, I would urge everybody to have a look at the medium-term system adequacy outlook. We'd update it every year. The last update came through in about October of last year. Under various scenarios, you see what is there. There is ample capacity up until about 2030, and there are some, as I said, the capacity definitely does reduce. We're aware of it. We're working together with all parties to make sure that that goes smoothly. So yes, our risk management systems fine-tuned through the havoc of load shedding. I'm pleased to say that we continue to operate the grid in a very conservative and responsible way. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Precious, some comments from you then on a risk-adjusted view of the RP. Obviously, there's a lot of dependencies to get things like nuclear and gas onto the grid in the timelines that we would like it to come on in terms of the RP. Some comments from your perspective, please.
Thanks, Brian. There is definitely various dependencies, particularly for the gas. However, we are in the market with the 2 gig of the gas bid window 1, and we are engaging, responding to the comments as and when they're being submitted to the office to respond to the capacity of that the system will require from the megawatt perspective. And also I can confirm that we are also engaging on the possibility of gas conversions of the the picking plant. So as part of mitigating the possibilities of the shortfall that it is envisaged in the plans from a capacity perspective, and various hybrid options that could also assist as part of the next bid window, the possibilities there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe just a question, Rob Lobo's question on, are you aware when the next TDP is coming out? There wasn't one in October 2025. Will it be 2026? Are you aware? If not you, maybe Andrew, and then I'll go on to other questions. Andrew, are you aware when the next TDP comes out?
Yeah, it'll be later this year, Brian, and it, once again, I think, as has been indicated, I think Precious indicated that it will be sort of very much this time integrated with the generation planning side. So I think for the first time, those two planning processes will now dovetail, and so I think that's going to be a very big and necessary step forward. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, a huge challenge, but critically important on that side.
Yeah, maybe I can just add that before. Sorry, maybe I can just add. There's another document called the GCCA, the Grid Connection Capacity Assessment, that will be coming out before the TDP, and I think this is also, have a look at that. It doesn't talk about the expansion, but talks about what capacity is available where. And this also touches on the duck curve and the criticality of bringing in flexible generation to deal with the variability of other generation that's been come. So I think that's an understanding of the grid and the challenges that we faced is included. Sorry, I'm running, but I'm speaking quickly just to get the point across. But it's not just about the TDP. It's sister document, the GCCA, will be coming out and well worth the read. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's very, very helpful. So the next question, perhaps one of the guys in the infrastructure component supply manufacturing side would be best to answer. But the question is from Prakshna Felter. If we agree that the future system must be flexible, transparent, and digital, what's stopping us from treating demand response and smart transmission as core infrastructure rather than optional add-ons? Who is well placed to add to that question? Mervyn, perhaps yourself?
I think ultimately, this investment into the grid, when I call it the legacy systems, where you've got a high install base of coal and you're now moving to renewable energy systems. The whole dynamics in terms of system stability and control, and that changes quite materially. And with that, it triggers a whole new demand in terms of infrastructure to support digital infrastructure in that, because you've got mini grids and that kind of thing. So ultimately, the technologies that would be needed would be, to an extent, digital, so local companies are investing in that. I mean, these solutions obviously exist internationally, and so I think from a local perspective, we need to reposition in terms of they call it the tools and systems and infrastructure to cater for that.
Great, thanks very much. The next two questions come back to you again, Precious. Solar's everywhere. This is from Roland Tatnell. Solar's everywhere, easy and cheap. More has been put in on rooftops and behind the meter in 5 years than built through REAP in 15. REAP has not managed to close wind for 2 bid windows. Why is IPP Office not more focused on encouraging wind in unconstrained areas? So perhaps a question around, is it possible in terms of the regulatory framework to have some sort of nodal procurement, and specifically around a substation, a region, etc.? And then at the same time, Precious, a question from Alborika Ratupitsani. Can you provide some visibility around local content requirements in the phase one? And I'm going to presume this is of the ITP. Will the selected consortiums be required to procure locally, or are there no explicit requirements for this? Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Wind, it is one of the technology that we would like to see thriving, as well as part of the IRP 2025 rollout. There are various mechanisms and interventions that are part of the designs of the next bid window to see how best we can address the unfortunate impacts that the industry has experienced. So as part of the next bid window design, definitely wind challenges are considered, and we are finding possible ways to see it thriving locally as one of the critical technology, and where we do have resources to take advantage of. With regards to the second point on the involvement of local, if I may refer to the announcement that we did when the pre-qualified bidders were announced in December, we outlined the scope that we engaged with DTIC on to what extent at this stage the local participants and the local industry and market is likely to be able to participate, so that it is still in the public domain. If there's still more information that is required. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Andrew, we're coming back to you. So a lot of questions for Andrew and Precious. Sabelo Maduna asks, and there's two questions that I'm going to read together. The question is around how the NTCSA intends to incorporate flexible dispatchable demand, particularly in relation to infrastructure and its efforts to modernize the grid. And I think some comments around the SAWIM would probably be relevant there as well. And then a question actually around the SAP, which I raised earlier, the SAP being the Southern African Power Pool. There is also opportunities for reducing congestion in the Eskom grid by utilizing SAP network, e.g. Northern Cape through Namibia and Botswana to Northwest Limpopo. And I know, for example, there was a massive grid upgrade of a 400 kV line up the west coast towards Namibia. So, Andrew, those two questions for you, and then I may have a chance for one more. Otherwise, it'll be moving towards closing comments. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Sabelo, for the questions. I think both, in a way, come down to market forces, which are going to rule. So, in terms of the flexible, dispatchable demand, this is where we are working actually with our colleagues, if I say our colleagues, former colleagues, whatever you want to call it, on the distribution, our distribution division of Eskom, looking at how we can really use electricity and the available capacity that's spare on the grid that I mentioned earlier to stimulate the economy and to get it going. Now, that flexibility is critical, and I've mentioned it previously as a key aspect that we need to keep the grid operable. So be it what's it, Bitcoin mining or whatever it is, that's I mean, everything's not that easy. But that flexible, dispatchable demand, but also I think on the generation side is really critical, and I think I made that point before. So, Sabelo, yeah, and ultimately what we want to do is, in addition to, I mean, looking forward on the market side, and to Brian, to your point, so it's not just about the day-ahead market, and like we'd like an ancillary services market, we'd like a reserve market. All of these are intended to actually stimulate investment in these particular technologies. So you'd actually be able to sell it into the market as, you know, as a viable product. On the Southern African Power Pool, yes, there are. We've got a big drive at the moment to work together with our Southern African Power Pool colleagues to look at opportunities to invest in upgrading the interconnectors, but everything is not that easy. And unfortunately, if we just take Namibia as an example, the grid is extremely constrained already in that particular area. So really what we want is we would want to sell more power to Namibia. We export power in the order of about 200 megawatts to Namibia at the moment. We'd want to export more in order to reduce congestion. But at the same time, Namibia are wanting to reduce the imports from South Africa and actually export to us. So this is the type of thing we have to actually say, this is definitely, you can actually make the situation a bit worse. We're talking about, I think, other example, Sabelo was on the east side. So let me talk about Mozambique again. Cahora Bassa is looking at they wanted to put up a massive array of PV panels at the dam. Now that sounds great, but again, it just leads to a whole lot of additional potential problems on operability. I'll leave one last thought, and that is, Brian, for 92 years of Eskom's history, basically the lowest point of demand in the day has been around 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. That's been the minimum. The minimum on the grid at the moment is in the middle of the day now. That shift has started in the last 6 months or so. Just to give you an idea of the tremendous changes, very exciting stuff. But how everything is changing and how I think Sabelo's points are critical. It comes about flexibility. So we've looked at expanding the grid and there's kilometers, etc. But the big test in the future is how do we make the grid and everything connected to the grid and the demand and the supply side more flexible. That's what it's about, and that's what the market is going to have to really focus on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That residual demand now being at 2 o'clock in the afternoon instead of 2 o'clock at night. I'm going to go to closing comments. I'm going to start with you, Precious. Literally 30 seconds. What are the key issues for each of you in terms of investment in grid capacity in the country?
From the IPPO office, we're saying let electrons follow the lines to unlock the scale and the pace of the next bid window. Thank you.
Thank you. Mervyn.
Yeah, Brian, my view is that we need to use the ITP, the TDP and the IPP programs to saturate local capacity on manufacturing as well as EPC. We need to maximize economic participation and social participation. So it cannot be that you exit projects just by importing it. So I think that for me is the most crucial thing, given the social and economic challenges in our country.
Thank you very much. Tafadzwa.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, from my side, really, the point is that, as we've mentioned, capacity exists. It is underutilized. Targeting that work domestically will effectively unlock a virtuous cycle of increasing the capacity to supply into this project without needing to, before the pressures to start investing in new capacity really kicks in. And yeah, the capacity exists. Thanks, Brian.
Sanjeev.
Yeah, no doubt. I think there's three things that's very positive, and we can clearly say we're going in the right direction. We've got SAWEM, ITP, and the integrated transmission plan, together with generation. I think all these are going to give visibility, make it much easier. So it's not just, the transmission build out is definitely an engineering challenge, but the opportunity is one of economic growth. So I think we're on the right path, and it's just about scaling up and speeding up.
Andre, last but not least.
Thanks, Brian. I think from our side, I can't comment on the engineering part, but one thing I can tell you is that the demand is there, and the businesses are excited and looking for ways to get more energy. So that won't be the holdup of this. I can assure you.
Well, thank you very much to my partners on the panel. Thank you very much for everyone participating, for the great questions. I understand that I haven't got to all of them, but it brings us towards the end. Shannon, back to you.
Thanks so much, Brian. That brings us to the end of today's discussion. A big thank you to our facilitator, Brian Day, and our panelists, Andre Etzinger from the National Transmission Company South Africa, Mervyn Naidoo from ACTOM, Tafadzwa Chibanguza from the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa, Precious Edward from the Independent Power Producers Office, Sanjeev Mungroo from Engie South Africa, and Andre Nepgen from Discovery Green for sharing their insights. Thank you also to all of our attendees for joining us and for contributing through your questions and comments. We'd like to once again thank our sponsors, ACTOM, the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa, Engie South Africa, Pele Green Energy, and Discovery Green for making this webinar possible. The recording of today's session will be shared soon, so keep an eye out for that email. We'd also like to invite you to join us for our next webinar on the 25th of February at 2 p.m. It will focus on new mining technologies. You'll find the registration link in the chat. And if you'd like to stay up to date with our upcoming webinars and news, be sure to sign up for our free daily newsletter or visit our website. You can also reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. So from all of us at Creamer Media Webinars, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.